Most people who feel stuck, exhausted, or like their life isn't moving the way it should, spend a lot of time looking for the big reason, the dramatic mistake, the obvious flaw, the clear moment where things went wrong. But for most people, that moment doesn't exist. What exists instead is something quieter and more pervasive, a collection of small, normalized behaviors that each seem harmless in isolation, that don't feel like problems because they feel like just how life is, and that collectively, across months and years, produce outcomes that feel mysterious and demoralizing. Not because something happened to you, because something has been happening inside your daily patterns, invisibly, for a long time. The behaviors worth examining aren't dramatic. They're not addiction, not failure, not anything you'd describe as obviously destructive. They're the kind of thing you'd defend if someone pointed them out, the kind of thing you'd say is normal, because it is normal. And that's precisely what makes them so difficult to see. Normal and harmless are not the same thing, and some of the most quietly damaging patterns in modern life are also the most universally shared. The reason they stay hidden isn't that people lack self-awareness. It's that the cost of each behavior arrives long after the behavior itself, quietly and without a clear label, in the form of exhaustion that doesn't make sense, stagnation that feels like bad luck, or a vague dissatisfaction that seems to have no specific cause. The first is chronic context switching, the habit of never being fully inside one thing for long enough to actually finish a real thought. This looks like checking the phone in the middle of a task, opening a new tab before the current one is processed, moving from one thing to another before any of them reach the depth that makes them meaningful. Each switch feels minor. The cumulative cost is significant. Every time the brain moves from one context to another, it takes time and energy to reorient, and part of the previous context lingers in the background, consuming bandwidth that should be available for the new one. Researchers who study this call it attention residue, the mental threads of unfinished tasks that stay partially active even after you've moved on, creating a state of perpetual partial focus that makes everything harder and nothing feel complete. A day of constant switching is genuinely exhausting, even when nothing important was done, and it produces a particular kind of mental fog that makes the simplest tasks feel harder than they should. More than that, it trains the brain to prefer shallowness over time. The discomfort of staying with one difficult thing, the resistance you feel at the 10-minute mark of any sustained mental effort, gets relieved so habitually by switching that eventually deep focus feels genuinely difficult to access even when you want it, even when the conditions seem right. Even when the task matters. The switching becomes the default, and a mind that defaults to switching is a mind that produces a fraction of what it's actually capable of every single day without ever knowing what it's missing. The second behavior is consuming information without ever applying it. This one is particularly seductive in the modern world, where content about improvement, about psychology, about habits and growth is available in unlimited quantity and presented in a way that feels like doing something. Watching a video about discipline feels slightly like being disciplined. Reading about focus feels marginally like focusing. The brain, which is genuinely bad at distinguishing between engaging with an idea and acting on it, releases a small reward for both. And so people spend years consuming the language of change without making any, accumulating insight that never becomes behavior, watching their knowledge base grow while their actual life stays the same, and wondering, with genuine confusion, why knowing so much hasn't moved anything. The knowledge isn't the problem. Knowledge is genuinely valuable. The gap between knowledge and consistent application is where lives stay the same. And that gap only closes through repetition in the real world. Through doing the uncomfortable thing rather than understanding it more clearly. Through applying something imperfectly rather than preparing to apply it perfectly. Every hour spent consuming more information about a problem you already understand well enough to act on is an hour that could have been spent reducing the gap. And the gap is always the thing that matters. The third is the quiet habit of mistaking comfort for rest. You finish a hard day and you collapse in front of a screen and you call it rest. And in one sense, it is. Your body is still. You're not working. The tension in your shoulders has slightly released. But comfort and restoration are different things, and the difference shows up the next morning. Comfort reduces the intensity of the current moment. Real rest rebuilds the capacity that was depleted. Passive screen consumption in the evening provides the first and often prevents the second, because it keeps the nervous system in a state of mild activation that blocks the deeper physiological and neurological processes through which actual recovery happens. The brain doesn't complete its maintenance cycle in a state of mild stimulation. It does it in genuine quiet. This is why so many people who spend their evenings watching things and scrolling through things wake up still tired. They were comfortable for several hours. They were not restored, and the deficit carries forward, invisible, into the next day and the day after that, until the baseline exhaustion becomes so familiar that people assume it's just who they are, just how they feel, just what being an adult in this era costs. It isn't. It's the accumulated bill of nights that felt like rest but weren't, and it's recoverable, but not through more comfort, through actual stillness, actual disengagement, actual quiet that the nervous system can finally use. The fourth behavior is treating your attention as infinitely renewable. You check the phone first thing in the morning, you fill every gap with input, you respond to everything as it arrives. You never protect a window of your best cognitive hours for the work that actually matters most to you. And because attention feels like it's always there, because you can always find some version of functioning regardless of how depleted you are, the cost of spending it carelessly is never obvious in the moment, but attention is not infinitely renewable. The quality of your attention at 9 in the morning, before any input has arrived, is categorically different from the quality at 3 in the afternoon after a full reactive day. The first is clear, generative, capable of real depth. The second is depleted, reactive, capable of managing things, but not building them. The most important work in your life, the work that builds something, that develops something, that moves the things you actually care about, deserves the former. It almost always gets the latter, if it gets anything at all. And when this pattern runs for long enough, people begin to believe they're simply not capable of deep, sustained, creative work, when what's actually happened is that they've been consistently bringing their worst cognitive hours to their most important work and their best hours to everyone else's priorities. The fifth is the behavior of staying in situations that stopped growing you, out of a combination of comfort, inertia, and the specific fear of uncertainty that makes the known feel safer than the unknown, even when the known is quietly shrinking you. This applies to jobs, to relationships, to habits, to environments, to versions of yourself that made sense at a certain point and no longer do. There's a version of loyalty that's genuine and valuable, and there's a version that's really just avoidance of the discomfort of change, dressed up in the language of commitment and practicality. Staying isn't always wrong. Sometimes staying is right and necessary and brave, but staying without examining whether you're still growing, whether the current situation is still the best available use of this particular season of your life, is a form of slow drift that feels like stability and functions like stagnation. The years pass in a place that fits well enough, and the discomfort never gets sharp enough to force a decision. And the version of you that could have developed in a more challenging, more aligned environment never fully forms. Not dramatically. Not with a single moment of clear loss, just quietly, year by year, through the accumulated cost of not asking the question, honestly enough. The sixth is the habit of processing emotion through distraction, rather than through feeling. Something difficult happens, something uncomfortable arrives, an anxiety, a frustration, a grief, a low mood, with no specific object, and the immediate response is to root away from it. Pick up the phone, start something, put something on, say emotion. This works, in the sense that the uncomfortable feeling is temporarily reduced. The edge comes off, the moment passes, but the feeling doesn't process while you're avoiding it. It waits. It lives in the body as a background tension, a low-grade weight, an unexplained heaviness that shows up in sleep quality, in concentration, in the inexplicable irritability that arrives in situations that shouldn't warrant it. In the general sense, that something is slightly off that you can't quite name. The habit of emotional avoidance, practiced for long enough, produces a person who is progressively cut off from their own interior life. The same mechanism that reliably blocks the difficult feelings also blocks the real ones, the genuine enthusiasm, the deep satisfaction, the actual grief that moves through you and releases rather than staying lodged. People who have been avoiding their emotions for years often describe feeling numb, flat, slightly distant from their own experience, as if watching their life from one step removed. That distance isn't a personality trait. It's the accumulated result of 1,000 small decisions to root around feeling rather than through it. And the way back is not dramatic. It's just the repeated practice of staying with discomfort long enough for it to move, which it almost always does when you stop fleeing it. The seventh behavior is the most invisible and possibly the most consequential, consistently prioritizing other people's definitions of progress over your own. This isn't about being a people pleaser in the obvious sense. It's subtler than that, and more pervasive. It's the accumulated effect of living inside social environments, including digital ones, where certain markers of success are constantly visible, constantly celebrated, and constantly reinforced, until your internal sense of whether your life is going well is calibrated almost entirely to external reference points rather than internal ones. You measure your progress against what you see around you. You feel behind when others appear ahead. You feel okay when the visible metrics align with the social standard. You pursue things partly because the pursuit is legible to the people around you, because it makes sense within the framework of what success is supposed to look like in your context, your age group, your social circle. And the things that actually matter to you, the quieter ambitions, the less photogenic goals, the definitions of a good life that don't translate neatly into visible achievement, get deprioritized or dismissed or quietly abandoned because they don't fit the external calibration you've been running on. This is where things get important. Because a life navigated by external calibration is a life that can technically succeed by every visible measure and still feel fundamentally empty. Because the things being achieved were never really yours. The exhaustion, the hollowness, the sense of going through motions that should feel meaningful but don't, often traces back to this, years of working toward something that someone else defined as worth working toward, inside a framework that was never built around what you actually value. These 7 behaviors share a common structure, and understanding that structure is what makes changing them possible. Each one feels like the path of least resistance. Each one has an immediate justification that seems perfectly reasonable. Each one produces a delayed cost that arrives so far from the behavior that the connection is almost impossible to trace. That's what makes them hidden, not that they're a secret. That the gap between cause and consequence is long enough and quiet enough that most people never draw the line between them. They experience the consequence, the exhaustion, the stagnation, the flatness, the sense of life not moving, and they look for explanations everywhere except inside the patterns that have been running quietly beneath the surface the entire time. And this is what makes recognizing them so significant, not as a reason for guilt or self-criticism, but as the specific, clear-eyed awareness that something you've been doing has been costing you something you care about. Because once you can see a pattern clearly, something that was invisible becomes visible, and something that was automatic becomes a choice. Not immediately, not without effort, but with a different kind of effort than before. One directed at the actual source, rather than at symptoms that will keep returning as long as the source stays intact. You don't have to address all 7 at once. In fact, attempting all 7 simultaneously is one of the most reliable ways to address none of them, because change attempted at too many points at once produces too much friction. The motivation collapses, and the old patterns return. What works is identifying the 1 or 2 that land most sharply, the ones where you felt the specific recognition of something true, and making a single structural change to the conditions that make that behavior automatic. Remove the phone from the room where you do important work. Create a 10-minute window in the morning before any input arrives. Let yourself feel something uncomfortable for 5 minutes before rooting to distraction. Ask honestly whether the thing you're chasing is something you chose or something that was handed to you as the definition of success. Small changes to structure, made consistently, produce compounding results over time that feel disproportionate to the size of the initial change. The behavior changes because the environment changed, not because you became a different person. And the outcomes change because the behavior changed, slowly and then noticeably, in ways that make the previous pattern seem, in retrospect, like something that had always been optional, something that was never quite as inevitable as it felt. Recognition is the first movement, not recognition as judgment, but as clarity, and clarity, finally, is always somewhere real to begin. If this felt familiar, comment ruining you. It helps me know this is something more people are silently dealing with.